Every human being is unique in the way their brains are formed. Neurodiversity is recognizing that there is this phenomenal diversity of intelligences, and that is something that should be celebrated. The World Health Organization statistics means that at least 1 in 5 of humankind are neurodiverse. There must be an evolutionary reason why. We need to recognize that throughout history, some of the geniuses were also autistic, dyslexic, dyspraxic. More than half of the current generation of Gen Z identify as neurodivergent. My brain is structurally and functionally different from this arbitrary normal person.
But what is normal? Is there a normal?
Yeah. Neurodiversity is as integral to life on planet Earth as biodiversity.
Welcome to Share, Dr. Lloyd.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Can we start by the basic question of what is neurodiversity?
Neurodiversity is an expression of the naturally occurring diversity of human neurocognitive ability and potential. Every human being is unique as their fingerprint in the way they look, the way they sound, but also in the way their brains and nervous systems are formed. We're born with genetic potential and probably about half our brain matter, and we learn to adapt in the environment that we're in, but we all have a preferred learning style and a preferred way of processing information from our environment. For probably a few centuries now, we've had this idea of, well, this is what intelligence is, and this is how we measure it. And if you don't learn the way we teach, and if you don't evidence your intelligence the way we measure it, then there is something wrong with you. Neurodiversity is recognizing that there is this phenomenal diversity of intelligences, in the plural, and that is something that should be celebrated. We need to recognize that throughout history, some of the geniuses and influential people that we learned about in our history lessons were also autistic, dyslexic, dyspraxic. According to the World Health Organization, Peter, 1 in 10 of humankind are dyslexic, 1 in 20 are ADHD, 1 in 10 have dyscalculia, which is a bit like the number version of dyslexia, 1 in 20 dyspraxia, which we used to think was just about motor skills, movement, but we also know it's cognition. That means that at least 1 in 5 of humankind have what in medicine is called a neurodevelopmental disorder, in education is called a learning disability. But within a neurodiversity paradigm, it's saying that actually not disordered, not errors of genetics, not disabled, simply different, and that if at least 1 in 5 of us have one of these different minds, then there must be an evolutionary reason why, and therefore that is the universal design, and that neurodiversity is as integral to life on planet Earth as biodiversity.
Okay, that's very interesting because the way you're describing it, so you mentioned that neurodiversity is the natural occurring of humans' neurotype, right? Mm-hmm. And we know for now at least that 1 in 10, 1 in 5, these are the stats that we have. But I believe, and you know better, there must be more people in that category that are not recognized yet. So knowing all of these, why are we then using the term neurotypical?
I'm not a big fan of dichotomies that divide and other people. I don't like the term neurodivergent. I prefer to identify as neurodiverse. We don't call people who of colour racially divergent. We don't call LGBTQ people sexually divergent. Why do we call people with dyslexia or ADHD or autism neurodivergent? But I also have to respect that people, have the right to identify how they choose in terms of their neurotype. And it's an evolving conversation and an evolving language. You think, Peter, about some of the ways that we've used to describe people of colour historically. Mm-hmm. In the UK, educationally subnormal or intellectually inferior. Right up until 1994, in the medical manuals in the UK, if you were LGBTQ, you were classed as mentally ill. Think of the words that we used to use for people with severe intellectual disabilities, where we used to refer to them as retarded, or people with physical challenges as invalids. So language evolves, and the cultural context changes. So I'm not a fan of dichotomies like neurodivergent versus neurotypical. There was an interesting piece of research done in 2023, indicated that the survey of Gen Z young people, that 53% of them identified as neurodiverse. So more than half of the current generation of under 25s identify as neurodivergent. And yet, according to our education system, that should only be somewhere about 15%. Historically, the mindset was, well, if you're not achieving in my class, it's either because you're lazy or you're not very intelligent, or there's something medically wrong with you. In the same way that historically we used to produce data to say, well, we know people of colour are not as intelligent as white people because look at the kind of jobs they have. We use selective abstraction of data almost to justify our cultural prejudices that are often unconscious. They're not necessarily always kind of intended that way. This idea that people who have a neurodevelopmental disorder, as it's called in the medical lexicon, being on the fringes of this standard distribution curve just doesn't exist anymore. That curve has got flatter and flatter. But I also think that reflects something that's really wonderful about today's generation of young people, and that is, you look at their friendship groups, and there are black kids, Asian kids, white kids, mixed race kids, dyslexic kids, autistic kids, straight, gay, they really don't care about those kind of things in the way my generation did. And I've reflected on that a lot. I think, well, there's so much more embracing of diversity.
That's very interesting, Tony. I feel like you and I have very opposite views on this last part of your comments, because so I did not grow up here. I grew up in Iran. And it was a very different cultural scene. It was a culture of, and I'm sure to an extent it was everywhere, it was a culture of respecting others, making sure other people are happy. It was like sacrificing a lot for the sake of other people. And so community, the sense of community and making sure everyone around us was happy was so big. So growing up, I remember there was so much more inclusion around me than what I see now in my children's school. I see there's a lot of exclusion, as if, as soon as they recognize in the playground that a child might be a little different from them, that child gets excluded. They use neurodiversity as an insult, like, why are you acting autistic? Or do you have ADHD? So I feel like, in a way, the more we're raising awareness about it, the more we're educating the society, the more children are using it to bully someone, to exclude someone.
As a way of trying to understand that, I would say that all children learn their prejudice and their exclusion of others from grown-ups. And in children, their motivation fundamentally is extrinsic, in that children's decision-making is led very much by emotion and the need for attachment and safety and protection. When I was at school, I can remember that the children who were in the special needs class were considered to be less than, that they didn't belong here. And I think if other children have picked up on this idea that some other child in their classroom, in their school, is somehow less than because of their neurodiversity, then that is something that they have been taught. Unwittingly, unconsciously, you would have to look at, well, what is it about our education system that tells the whole school population that they're not like us, they don't really belong here? I hear what you're saying, And I think it's indicative of the culture and the messaging that has existed within our education system, that you've got to be a certain type of child to belong here. Even to the point where, well, if you're not a grade A student, you don't really belong in this school. But by the way, we teach this way and we measure your intelligence this way. So even if you've got a genius IQ, like Leonardo da Vinci or Albert Einstein, more modern history, Steven Spielberg or Stephen Fry or Annie Lennox or Alison Moyer, all these other amazingly talented, gifted, intelligent people that we see in public life, would they have all been in the special needs class? And of course, until 2012 in the UK, like with ADHD, you grew out of ADHD on your 16th birthday. You can't have it as an adult. And up until 2008, you were only allowed to have one neurodevelopmental condition. You weren't allowed to have two. That was like too much. But we know that 43% of people with ADHD are also dyslexic, and that at least 29% of people with ADHD are also autistic. But all of these things overlap. So we all have co-occurring traits. They might be below the threshold for a diagnosis. There are 2.5 million people with ADHD in the UK, if the World Health Organization statistics for prevalence are correct. There are only 260,000 people who are diagnosed and taking medication for ADHD. 260,000 out of 2.5 million. And of the 2.5 million people with ADHD, not everybody might want a diagnosis. Not everybody might need a diagnosis. A diagnosis in a medical context means, well, what is wrong with you? And we use in the medical lexicon terms like the disease burden of ADHD or the disease burden of autism. I don't consider myself to have a disease, and I don't consider myself disordered. That is not to say that living with ADHD and autism, and indeed dyslexia and those other things, does not come with challenges in a world that was never designed for you because you were invisible. I only know what it's like as somebody who lives with an ADHD neurotype, and I would say that most of the time ADHD for me is okay. There are some things about it which are an asset. There have been certain stages in my life or certain contexts where my ADHD has caused me significant struggle and impairment. There are certain things that I'm very good at in a professional capacity and certain things that I'm not. I don't have a fantastic working memory, but I use a lot of technology, so I effectively have an external hard drive for the frontal lobe of my brain. ADHD, as Ned Halliwell said, is a bit like having a Ferrari brain with bicycle brakes. And I would describe it as being you have a hyper-awareness and a hypersensitivity. It's like watching 6 televisions in the same room, and you only want to watch one, but you can't filter out the other 5 because something called the default mode network in your brain doesn't work the same way as most people. Now, just because it's different doesn't mean it's less than.
Or doesn't mean it's broken.
Or does it mean it's broken. ADHD, autism, these are all very, very broad spectrums. If you've met one person with ADHD, you've met one person with ADHD. We are so much more than just our genetic inheritance, aren't we? We're the product of our environment, our experience, the traumatic events that happen to us, the love and the kindness and the wonderful experiences that can happen to us, all shape who we are and all shape how we process information from our environment and the world that we live in, and how we make sense of it, and how we make sense of the people that live in that environment. All of those things can shape us. But I've often wondered what it is about, you look at, say, people like Richard Branson, for example, who's an internationally well-known entrepreneur who has ADHD and dyslexia. what is it that makes some people thrive and achieve? And despite, or maybe not despite, but because of their neurodiversity, and what is it that breaks other people? And I think for many of the children that I've worked with over the years, school has done so much harm.
Exactly.
Perhaps unintentionally, but nonetheless, it's done so much harm. And, you know, we adults always think we know what's best for children, don't we? But I think we don't really listen to them as much as we should. And I hope that the current review of neurodiversity in education is one where young people's voice is really heard, because too often it's the so-called experts who make the decisions but don't know necessarily what it's like.
I don't want to undermine that ADHD or neurodiversity in general can affect people in different ways and become challenges. But then again, you just mentioned something that I've always been thinking. Is it the ADHD, is it the neurodiversity, or is it the support system and the environment that we grow up in?
Well, it is obviously partly our genetic inheritance in terms of how our brain processes information. I mean, my brain is structurally and functionally different from whoever this arbitrary normal person is in the middle of the bell curve.
But what is normal?
Well, that's the whole point. I mean, I think...
Is there a normal?
Yeah, no, there isn't. Of course there isn't. We used to think that being white was normal and being straight was normal, when really what we mean is, are you like us?
Yes.
You have to be a certain way and think a certain way and learn a certain way and have certain values and certain attitudes and certain beliefs in order to belong here, because we have always had these long-standing cultural hierarchies.
I understand to an extent the limitations become so much that you can refer to certain things as a disability. I live with a child who is neurodiverse and he has severe disabilities because his condition has limited him in every way. You know, he cannot be independent. He cannot speak. He cannot do things that like children of his age do. But when it comes to millions of other people that, you know, as you said, have different neurotypes, does it all need diagnosis and medication and cure?
No, and I think as well, again, it depends on the context, doesn't it? What does a child need to thrive and achieve their potential? That's the measure. It's not about ranking them. We don't measure their ability to rank them. Well, we shouldn't. We should be measuring their ability to identify what their needs are and what their strengths are and how we enable them to flourish and achieve their potential. Whatever that might be, butcher, you know, tailor, candlestick maker, what, you know.
Absolutely.
I would like to believe that we are getting to a world, Peter, where children will just be children. And when we ask them what their needs are, we can define it as they need to be loved and cared for. And in order for us to do that effectively, we need to understand them and not have mistaken notions of intelligence or the perfect child who, you know, is a child who functions in a way that is at the complete convenience of the adult. Being human means being different. If everybody's brain is as unique as their fingerprint, if everybody's voice and facial features are unique to them, then that's got to be the universal design. And that is something that we should celebrate.
And that took me to my next question. So from my understanding, you worked with so many creative, successful people, genius minds. I may know that a lot of people that are now proven to be neurodiverse have genuinely enriched our lives, right? I mean, where would we be without them? How would we have all these advancements in medicine, in technology, and so many different fields? However, they are, a lot of times, they feel like they don't fit in. And I'm referring to adults. As a person who has lived the experience himself and has been working with neurodiverse individuals, and you're an expert in the matter, how do you think the society can help adults fit in and not feel marginalized?
I think we need, for our policymakers, our politicians, to acknowledge the reality of neurodiversity and in a public way and celebrate it. But I understand that we have legal systems and policies in place where we are in a state of flux around, well, what is a disability? What is a disorder? What is a medical condition? What is a difference? Recognizing that everybody is unique and one person's ADHD or autism is going to be slightly different to somebody else's in terms of how it impacts on them. You know, you made a really valid point, Peter, before. There are so many famous musicians that we have all been to see in concert, whose records we have bought, who I know are ADHD and dyslexic and autistic. There are most of the comedians that people watch on television, I know are either ADHD or dyslexic. A lot of television news presenters, a lot of journalists, a lot of MPs in the House of Commons, including some former prime ministers who I know have neurotypes like ADHD and dyslexia and autism. So how is it that, this question about how can some people really thrive and others not? And I think it's about connection in every sense of the word. Connection as a human being to other human beings who nurture you and help you thrive in whatever way you can, but also connection in terms of people who are able to provide you with opportunities. So, it's not just about your neurotype, it's also about what school you went to and which part of the country you were born. And I think that if we get to a point where we can accept neurodiversity as a given, as a natural part of the diversity of humankind, in the same way they would accept people who have a different colour skin or a different sexual orientation, then we've got to get to that point where we no longer consider people as, or rather view them as less than or other than
them and us.
Because they're different.
So you're talking about connection and you're talking about inclusivity. First of all, what does inclusivity look like in the society, if you can describe it to me? Or what would it look like ideally? I think that's a better question.
I don't think we should educate children in an intellectual apartheid in the same way that we used to educate them in racial apartheid, where white children didn't go to school with black children. All of us grow up in a very diverse world, where we are surrounded by people who are different from us. So I think in our education system, the idea that we should segregate and separate some children from others because of some cultural notion of who is less than is unhelpful to society. Children need to know that the world is full of people who are different from them, and they need to understand that the fact that they might be intellectually talented and achieving in school does not necessarily mean that they're intelligent. I know lots of people who've got lots of degrees who can't boil an egg. So we have, I know lots of people in government who are autistic and ADHD. That doesn't mean they're intelligent. We've had prime ministers who are neurodiverse. Just because they went to Oxford doesn't make them intelligent. So inclusion, is about accepting a fundamental value and worth and right to belong to any other human being. It is, I think, incumbent upon us to facilitate respect and the valuing of other human beings by virtue of their humanity. And citizenship and values are absolutely intrinsic, in my view, to education. In a 21st century, rapidly changing, technology-driven world that is now a global village where young people have friendships with other young people in different continents across social media, not just in the street where they live. And therefore, this age of identity politics that we have now, where lots of young people assign lots of labels to themselves, I think is an expression of them trying to understand who am I and where do I belong. And I think given that over 40% of young people at the moment meet the diagnostic criteria for anxiety and depression, The number of children and young people who've developed eating disorders and obsessive compulsive disorders, number of young people who are addicted to things like vaping and energy drinks and high sugar processed food, etc. They are telling us something about their need to understand who they are and their place in the world. And I don't think we can facilitate that using purely things like mathematics or GCSE English.
We know that neurodiverse people face a significantly higher risk of unemployment, depression, suicide compared to the wider population. How can we help a neurodiverse adult fit in the society and work environment? Are there any adjustments that the society can make for them?
I think there is, and it's an interesting question as well, because at the moment we have within the Equality Act certain safeguards for people in relation to protecting their rights based on a designated set of criteria and whether or not they are legally labelled as disabled. Within law, the right to have reasonable adjustments in the workplace is not a fixed concept, because if I work in a large company with thousands of employees, then the resource and the flexibility available to my employer to provide me with a quieter room or other types of technology that not everybody else has, or any other support mechanisms that enable me to do my job, it might be very different to what is a reasonable accommodation for an employer of a company that only employs 2 or 3 people who work in one room. I also think I'm concerned that a lot of people who recently identified as neurodiverse are now seeing themselves through a deficit-based medical lens of, well, this is what's wrong with me, and this is what I'm going to need to have this.
That's a very good point, exactly.
And, you know, I've had people say to me, well, you know, I'm late every day, and, you know, I'm getting into trouble, but I can't help it because that's my ADHD. And I say, I'm sorry, I'm not accepting that. Get an earlier train. There's a healthy, I think, a constructive way to deal with that challenge, and that is to say, okay, then, you know, discuss with your boss, can I have a flexible start time? That, you know, if I've got to be in at 9, then my arrival time, as long as I'm there before 10. But the understanding is, I have to work an hour later at the end of the day, because it's not everybody else's responsibility to do my job for me just because I can't get into work on time. I had another instance where somebody contacted me about a member of staff who'd made a racial slur to a colleague and said, well, it's because of my ADHD. That's just not acceptable. So finding out as an adult, it's great, but what concerns me is if people view themselves is through a deficit medical lens of, well, this is what's wrong with me, rather than this is what's strong with me. I hope people will see that as something that is uniquely wonderful about them. And yes, we know that sometimes those neurotypes come with challenges because of the world we live in, but it isn't always going to be that way. For many adults who are coming to an adult diagnosis, in many ways, it's about self-understanding. And, you know, let's remember a lot of people with, you know, there's 80-odd% of us who never got a diagnosis, and somehow we've thrived, and lots of people with these neurotypes lead very happy, healthy and successful lives.
If people wanted to access you, is there a specific website or where can they find you? drtonylloyd.com. Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Lloyd, for giving your time. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I'm sure that the viewers are going to learn a lot.
Thanks very much.
Having you.